example, they work through the courts and media to create an atheist world by eliminating anything to do with religion so far as he or she is able. So what people don't realize when they remove, let's say, every aspect of belief in God from the government and the school system and so forth, is they're actually, when they shove that out, something else moves in, and that's atheism. And the mistake people make is think that atheism is pounding the table and yelling and screaming that there's no God. No. Atheism is simply not believing that God exists. And so when you create an atheist government and an atheist society, you simply create a government that runs without the existence of God, but does not in any way influenced by the belief in the existence of God and so forth. So I knew a fellow personally who led the charge for banning also any kind of religion in the Ontario school system. And I think the title of the organization was something like Integrity of Science or something like that. It's been a number of years now. That's been tossed out of the school system a long time ago, anything to do with religion. But what the general population thought it was just, oh, this is a scientist who is genuinely concerned, really nice guy about science. But in my own personal interactions, no, he hated Christianity to the point where he would just become red in the face and almost incoherent with rage. And he formed this organization with a specific view of attacking Christianity and obliterating from the schools and governments and everything else. That would be maybe an angry atheist illustration, but there's some really nice activist atheists who just believe that a religion-free world would just be the best one. Like the word, I think it was John Lennon, his song called Imagine. Imagine there's no religion. And it's just this utopian belief that everything would be wonderful. Then there's one I actually debated. He would be an example of an activist atheist. Eddie Tabash is a constitutional lawyer in the United States. I debated him a number of years ago on, I think, 3 different universities here in Canada over a period of 3 different nights, 3 nights in a row. And one of them was at Queen's University. And what his strategy was to argue for the separation of church and state in the United States. But what the general American didn't realize is that, no, this man actually is an atheist and he wants to obliterate all belief in God in the USA. And he sees the vehicle to do that as through the courts in the separation of church and state. Now, I should say something about separation of church and state here, because I believe it's important too, but for a totally different reason. And I have a different idea of what church and state means. Originally, and this was in a talk given at the University of Waterloo by, the name escapes me at the minute. He was in one of the highest positions in the United Nations from Lebanon. Charles Malik is his name. And he said the separation of church and state was to be the separation of institutions. And that is, you don't have the same institution that governs the church as the same one that governs government. The separation of church and state is meant to protect Christianity from the automatic corruption that occurs when Christianity is in a position of power for ruling in government.
You can see that happening in Russia right now, where the Russian Orthodox priests are blessing the weapons that are being used in the war against Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, that's really sad. That's terrible, actually. But so when you have the means to power, means that you also have to be religious, then you'll have a lot of people faking that they're religious so they can get in a position of power, and you have total corruption of religion if there's no separation in institutions between church and state. But Charles Malik pointed out that it was never intended to be a separation of ideas. Never. So you have ideas being very important in government legislation, whether they're scientific ideas, sociological ideas, but all of a sudden when it comes to religion, what people like Eddie Tabash have done is you're not even allowed to bring those ideas, those theistic ideas, into play as either. So the separation of church and state has gone beyond just separation of institutions to a total separation of ideas. In fact, going further than that and freeing really freeing government institutions and the schools and the public life from any ideas at all, anything to do with religion, and that, but it's still done under the name of separation of church and state. And so that's where you see a lot of confusion today. And they say, yeah, that shouldn't be. I would argue
it
that
is interesting, though. It's not all religion usually that's being pushed out of the schools. It's just the dominant Christian religion that's normally being pushed out of the schools.
absolutely. In fact, I have a friend of mine who graduated in education, and she was twice hauled into her principal's office as a teacher and just verbally flogged for having mentioned anything to do with Christmas. It was coming up to Christmas, well, anything to do with the traditional Christmas story, the birth of Christ or whatever, to the point of tears. But yet she was forced to, in her class, bring in religious leaders from other religions to do a religious ceremony from other religions. But anything to do with Christianity was a severe reprimand from the principal for having done anything to do with that. So often it's seen as mostly the attacks are against Christianity, but not all the time. Like, for example, I think what's going on in Quebec right now is a general attack on all religion. And then you get other countries, let's say, that have pretty severe attacks against other religions and promoting, not without going into detail.